Have you ever wondered what therapists really talk about when they're off the clock? Are you looking to embrace open discussions about mental health while also laughing and relating to real content? Well, if so, you found the right place. Welcome to Unfiltered Therapists, a Kindred Roots Therapy Inc. podcast where the world of therapy meets candid conversations. Our podcast is tailor made for those who are ready to navigate life's challenges with humor, authenticity, and a dash of therapy wisdom. Our mission is very clear here to make therapy accessible and inviting. We want you to feel like you're part of our circle, relating to our discussions and finding nuggets of insight that resonate directly with you. Whether it's conquering anxiety, embracing self acceptance, discovering the latest therapeutic approaches, or just wanting to listen to other people bitch about their moms, we've got you covered. Join us as we kick back, shoot the shit, because believe it or not, us therapists do that too, and explore the depths of mental health, the human experience, and the overall road to wellness. We'll be here to answer your questions, discuss the topics you're most curious about, and create an atmosphere that feels like sitting on a cozy couch, chatting with your friends. If you're ready to laugh, not in agreement, and feel like you're part of a supportive community, hit the subscribe button and get ready for unfiltered conversations. This is Unfiltered Therapist, and we're about to break barriers, embrace growth, and invite you to join in this journey of true, authentic self-discovery. Let's do this.
Wow. Okay.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
So, today is the day. I am joined by Claire. I should say I, as in Allegra. I'm joined by Claire today. And we are going to be discussing another super juicy topic. I don't feel like when we decided to do a podcast, we had any intention of doing such like big topics, but like, I can't help it. We're just interesting people, I guess. What can I say? But today we are discussing it was actually, I want to be honest, a hard title. It's a hard title to decide how to like summarize this, but we kind of landed on religious shame and healing, the religious guilt that comes with being raised by families or within a church or denomination. And I feel like this will be a very interesting topic because my vibe tells me that like everyone would be impacted by this topic very differently. I hope that that's fair to say, but I actually really want to open the floor first for you to introduce yourself because most people that follow our practice know you through my lens, and I want them to know you through your lens, and then maybe tell us a bit about why you picked this topic.
Sounds good. Yeah. Hi, I'm Claire. I use she, her pronouns. And I work with Kindred Roots as a counselor, therapist. And then I'm also working on a youth outreach team with child and youth mental health for counseling as well. And yeah, I think to be honest, this is something that is pretty personal to me. And it's something that it's hard to know where the right place is to talk about it. And so I think when we talked about this podcast, it's something I'm passionate about and that I think is important to put out there because it's quite controversial. So yeah, I don't know. It's something that I thought would be a good conversation to have. And I think it's so complicated that like a post or like even a blog post just couldn't quite get it for me. So that's what led me to talking about it here.
Yeah, I actually like really respect that. I think you of everyone on our team are probably the most thoughtful about like how you go about discussing topics on a public platform, and I give you major kudos for not being too shy to talk about something that has this much weight for you personally, because I know it will have a lot of meaning for other people. I know this is a topic that we're seeing more often come through, and for me, I was raised in a household that did not have any connection to religion, very like spiritual in terms of believing maybe in a higher power or karma or whatever you want to call it. But it's a topic that I've even been scared to delve into because it's not something that I really understand. So I guess why don't we start with talking a little bit about your personal early experiences with religion.
Yeah, fair. I think that, yeah, I'm gonna do a little disclaimer because then I'm gonna feel better. But I think for me, like I am definitely more of a private person. So it is a bit uncomfortable coming on a platform and talking about it. I think that it's different when it's like you and me chatting or us in like a group team meeting. But
Yeah.
it's another thing when it's like a podcast, anybody can find it on the internet. So I think it's just, yeah, it is a vulnerable place to be, but I do think that it's important. And I think too, just putting it out there, I'm like careful around the wording we use and just like how it's communicated because there are a lot of people in my life who I love who, yeah, who honestly, this is going to be hard to watch. So I think just starting it from that perspective. And I think too, like it is really controversial. And like you said, a lot of people have a lot of different experiences. So just putting it out there that this is my personal experience. I think that different religions and spiritualities and faith like serve people in different ways. And it can bring a lot of like good things and comfort and community and all of those things. So
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like shame any specific religion. It's more just about maybe some of the aspects of religion that can be harmful. And so talking about that side of things too. So just a bit of a disclaimer there because it's important. And again, it's my experience and my perspective. I'm sure it would be very different for very different people.
I
Yeah.
actually, yeah, and I think that that's totally fair. One of the things that I think we really stand for is that we're not very polarized in any way. Like, it's not that we believe that people have to be one way or another way. It's more so like an acceptance that everyone's going to look at the same topics very differently. And thank you for sharing that this is your personal experience. You know, I want to make it clear to everyone that when we're planning these podcasts, I don't put any pressure on anyone to disclose anything that they don't think is important for others to maybe resonate with or feel normalized by. But none of us are claiming that this is the way that everyone has to feel or see things. It's just more so having hard conversations publicly to encourage other people to also have hard conversations.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. For
All
sure.
right.
Yeah.
Well, tell us
Yeah, let's get
what's the
into
experience? Let's get into
it.
it. Yeah.
So I think for me personally, I was raised Catholic, and my family is Catholic. And so I think that for me, like growing up, I wouldn't say my parents were like super, super strict about kind of like the rules or following certain things, but it was more like the general, like you should believe in these things and you should act a certain way and so on and so forth. So it kind of just looked like going to church on Sundays like a regular basis and um talking about God and Jesus a lot, all of that jazz and Sunday school. Like it wasn't my life. I think that's important to put out there too, is like I went to school separately. Like my education was separate and a lot of my friends that I grew up with were not Catholic or maybe were like baptized or but not like practicing Catholic. I hate those words, but I think
Yeah.
it's an important distinction.
Yes.
So I think that for myself, there was a lot of shame around like there's one way of doing things or like one way that you're kind of supposed to live. So like your partner is the opposite sex, you do not live together until you're married, all of these kind of things. And again, I think my parents were a little bit more flexible around um like specifically sex before marriage. It was like, okay, maybe you don't have to be married, but you have to be like financially stable and so on and so forth. So I would say there was some like leniency. And again, loved my parents, but I think there was a lot of just like this is the right kind of way of doing things. And I think that that's definitely reinforced in the church and in going to church. So
Right.
I think that there was a lot of talk about like in church. I struggled a lot growing up with like the sexism, honestly. So like women couldn't be priests. There was a lot of conversation around um like obeying your husband, and that just did not resonate with me. I think that like partnership is really important and that Yeah. So again, I think that just the way that the language speaks and like the Bible speaks can be harmful in that way. And so, yeah, the sexism piece was really tough for me. I think when I was quite young, I actually did identify as very religious and very Catholic. Like, I really believed in it. It was what I was taught and what I thought was important. And so, when I started like getting older and questioning these things, like being like, okay, this seems not right for
Mhm.
me, it felt really wrong. Like I was doing something really wrong or disobeying what I was supposed to be thinking.
Yeah.
Um, so that was challenging. I think too with like homophobia in the Catholic Church. So people who are gay or queer could not be married in the Catholic Church. That was something I really could not get on board with. So when I was younger, I think I was like 12 and I wrote a letter about like these things that I didn't think were okay. And I was like going to do something about it. So, and obviously it went absolutely nowhere, but
Mhm.
it was just kind of the start of realizing like these things don't match my
Mm.
values. And so I think that in itself was just really challenging because like you're 12 years old, you're trying to do what you're supposed to do. I'm a people pleaser. So it's like I don't want to upset parents or like the community or whatever. Um,
That actually
so
leads me to one of my questions. How did you know or learn to question the things? Because I'm thinking from like a nature versus nurture perspective, because you're raised in a household that is Catholic and that's kind of your exposure point. You're going to church, you're, going to Sunday school. How did you learn to question what you were seeing and start to like identify that you maybe weren't fully in alignment with those values?
yeah, I think it was a very gradual process, to be honest. I think that um like honestly my mom is quite a feminist, I would say, and is very like doesn't live those things, and my dad as well. Like I think he takes on a lot um more of like what would be considered I hate even saying like the female role, it doesn't feel good, but I think they're just a lot more of a partnership and they don't necessarily live in that way. And so I think it didn't match even what I was necessarily seeing to an extent. And then I think too just like identifying as a woman myself, like I was like, this seems very unfair and not great.
Yeah.
And then also like I said, like a lot of my friends, like yes, I technically went to Catholic school, but a lot of people I think were not like so deep into the church community. And so yeah, I was still like a normal teenager experiencing normal teenager things. So yeah, I think it was a very gradual thing where more and more pieces just didn't align,
Right.
and it was starting to feel yeah, not like the right fit for me.
Did you find that like the community that you had in the church itself versus the community you had at like a Catholic school was drastically different in like what varying degrees people were living or accepting of more traditional Catholic ideology?
100%, yeah. I felt like I was at a Catholic school, and I would say like maybe a few people that I went to school with I would see at church, and I think that this is again my experience, my opinion, but I felt like the way that we were being raised was a lot different and maybe a lot more strict. There was a lot more like shame involved in that. And so I definitely think it was like a different experience. Like yes, we had like assemblies or whatever. I can't remember what they even called them in Catholic school, like liturgies or where we'd go to the gym and we'd all pray or whatever. But it's like,
Mm,
it's once a week, it's a group, you're like with your friends. It's not really what you're focused on, honestly, at least in my experience.
fair.
Whereas I feel like when it's in a lot of your like language and the way that you're being raised or like taught what's right and wrong is when it can be quite harmful and in general, but that's how it was for me, I would
From your
say.
experience. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the biggest where it started like really becoming polarized was when I was a teenager and specifically around like sex and purity culture and all of that. So I think that there was a lot of I don't think. For me, there was a lot of shame and stigma around sex and around like your worth kind of being tied to your virginity and all of this
Mm,
stuff. So I think as somebody who like you're a teenager, you're having these like very normal urges and hormones and experiences. And instead of that being like normalized and education being provided, it was like, you shouldn't be feeling that way. It's sinful, it's whatever.
Right.
So it made it really hard to talk about any of those things. And as we know, like when you don't get the information, you try to find it in maybe not the best ways or on the internet or whatever. And that can
Mm,
be harmful.
yes.
Yeah. So I think when it came to that age was when I really started to internalize those things.
Mm.
And yeah, when self-worth was tied to things that I don't think it should be.
Right. I'm curious about the term purity culture because I feel like I always hear purity culture and assume we're talking about sex or someone's relationship with their virginity. Is that what purity culture entails, or is there more to purity culture than just someone's relationship with sex?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And again, like it's so tricky. This is just my perspective. I think it's very different for different people. But I think my perspective is yes, it is related to sex and like virginity, where it's this idea of like being pure. And if you have lost your virginity, then you're no longer pure in this way. You're supposed to wait until marriage, blah blah blah. I think it's also about like in my head it's about like modesty. So for example, if like say I was wearing like a crop top when I was a teenager or whatever, it's like what kind of attention are you trying to attract? Like
Mm,
it was almost like it was put on you as something you're doing wrong. If somebody says something inappropriate or does something inappropriate, it's like okay, well, so it's kind of that same. I think that it perpetuates like rape culture, to be honest, and I think that it's
mm,
quite harmful. So I do think it's more than just sex itself. I think it's the way that like consent is talked about or not talked about, I should
yeah.
say. And it's a lot bigger than just necessarily your virginity or not.
Right. What's the effect of purity culture or the idea of purity when we're talking about young boys or men in comparison to women?
So I think it's hard for me to say because I like my experiences as a woman, but the biggest thing I think that comes to my brain is just like that it's not consent and pieces like that are not openly talked about because it's this assumption like coming from a Catholic perspective is that you're only having sex if you're planning on procreating and having a child. So it's like
Mm,
if you're not doing that, then you're not having sex. And so we don't talk about, so there's no talk about any types of like contraceptive or like safe sex or any of that. Cause it's this understanding that you've waited until marriage and you're having sex with this one person and all of those things. And that,
yeah.
yeah. So I would say just a lack of information, a lack of education. So there's no talk about consent, about contraceptives, about any type of other sex than just men and women, which is also so harmful.
Right.
So I think, yeah, my perspective again is just like a huge lack of information around
Right.
healthy, safe, consensual things.
Yeah. How did you learn more about like the safe side of sex or consent or really anything that's more like anti-purity culture when you were a teenager starting to question if what you were being told was not necessarily what you fully believed in?
Right. Well, I think this is where some of the anger comes from, honestly, for me, is that like when again, like you're a teenager, those things are so stigmatized as it is.
Mm.
So yeah, it would be like Googling things, and obviously you read a million things on Google, like some that are really not helpful. So I
Yeah.
think it's just and realistically, like porn is can be really unhealthy for some people too. So it's just maybe not finding quality information. So it would be like Google or through friends or whatever. So I think, yeah, luckily, again, I feel like it was really helpful for me to have friends who weren't raised in the same way because we could have more of those open conversations and there was a lot less shame in those spaces. So I can't imagine what that would be like for somebody who doesn't have those spaces to have the
Right.
conversations. But yeah, I would say it was just like any teenager, like Googling or like asking friends. Um,
Right.
yeah, so probably not the best way to get information for sure.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I wonder if that's connected to slash I kind of want to ask about what it means when we talk about like religious trauma. Like what is religious trauma?
Yes, again, a tricky one. I think maybe I'm not quite sure how we do it because I have never recorded a podcast, but maybe we can include some literature too, just for anybody
Totally.
who wants to read that. But I think from again my perspective, it's similar to like a type of trauma. I think it's been compared to like PTSD or
Mm,
complex PTSD, where it's just this like views that you have that have been quite ingrained, that have caused like harm or shame or trauma in some way. And I think what's really confusing for a lot of people and has been confusing for me is like this is not a common term I think that's like thrown out there. So for me at least it's taken a really long time to like come to terms with that maybe this is some of the things I've experienced. So I think it used to be maybe like a lot of anger towards my parents or like distancing myself from them and from the church. And it's taken a really long time to get to that point of like, oh, maybe these things do really resonate. And I think the words religious trauma is so heavy that
mhm.
it's hard to be like, yep, that's the right fit because it's confusing and it is a bit of like it's a bit dialectical where it's like these are people that you love and they truly believe in these things and they are trying to do the best, but it's also been like extremely harmful in certain ways. So it's a
Totally.
tricky thing I think to balance.
Mhm.
um yeah, and I think for religious trauma specifically, it really varies for people. Like there's people who have been in like full-blown cults where like every aspect of their life is connected to religion. And
Right.
so I'm sure that that would be a very different experience. Whereas like I said, I had spaces that weren't, and that was really helpful for me to see like where my values lie and that it's okay if they don't match with how I've been taught.
Right.
Um, and I think too, like the religious trauma is just so complex. Like I think that for some people there's like sexual abuse connected to the church and there's a lot of other pieces.
Yeah.
So for me it's more about like shame and things that I've unlearning. And I think just this idea of like there's a lot of shame around even now, like that I'm not practicing or that I don't agree with those things. It's
Mm.
kind of like I'm lost in some way. Like I'm
Mhm.
sorry that you don't have this like pillar of faith, or it's like I'm missing out in some way. So I
Right.
think it's still very active, just maybe in a different way than it used to be. Um
I hear
yeah.
that interestingly from like I almost am hearing this that like and maybe again obviously perception based but like religion itself may not be the source of the trauma, but the pipeline of religion to other pockets of trauma is very strong and unfortunately traditionally common. And I think we know from a more public stance, like the sexual trauma that's related to the Catholic Church, for instance, has become a very public topic and things that a lot of
Mhm.
people can make that connection to. I also think just as like a trauma therapist, when we talk about like what trauma actually is, like I think about from the perspective of really any trauma that it's very seldom that someone's like, I'm a trauma survivor, I've experienced trauma. Most people are like, well, it wasn't as bad as it could have been, so it can't be trauma, it can't be traumatizing. And we
For sure.
take the word trauma like it's huge, it's just like, it has to be everything in order to call it trauma. But
Mhm.
it's anything that kind of messes up our core beliefs of ourselves and makes it hard to decipher what is a fair judgment of self versus not. And I could see there being a lot of issues with that. I think, in terms of there being a very black and white understanding of what's right and what's wrong, and then wanting to question and live in the gray. It's like if you're not in the white, then you're instantly in the black, and you don't want to be, but there's not room for gray. Um, do you think, like, because obviously we see a lot of stuff in media too about the church trying to be more progressive and trying to find more gray, do you find that that is something that is making your experiences today better, or do you find that that's not necessarily as active as it might be perceived to be from like an external perspective?
My opinion is that it's not as active as like realistically, I think like as of recently, or the last few years, the Pope has come out and said, like, that who are we to judge around people being gay, but like people still can't get married in the church. And there are people who are Catholic and who believe in that and who are with a same sex partner,
Yeah.
sorry, same gender, and it's just not okay. So I think realistically, like, yes, maybe they're saying things that for the Catholic Church is profound, but like to catch up to modern society is not. So yeah, I would say no from my opinion.
Yeah.
Yes, maybe things are changing, but it's like at a pace that is not okay, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
fair.
Yeah.
How would you say that all of this has affected you today, or like how does it show up in your life presently?
So I think it's just been a lot of unlearning. Um, I think for sure, like there was specific experiences throughout growing up that I would consider traumatic. So I've had to kind of process those and to not internalize those things so much. And so, yeah, I think unlearning a lot of the things specifically around like how I choose to live my life and that that is okay. And around, I think for sure, like sexual shame and,
Mm.
um, yeah, just like healthy sexuality is something that's been a huge learning curve. And then also I would say just around like family, like I said, love my family, love my parents, but it's still um like they are not happy that I'm not
Mm.
practicing. They think I'm missing out. So it's that idea of like just validating that like I am not. It's okay to make this decision. I'm not anything less. I'm not whatever because I choose not to believe in these same things. So yeah, like realistically, my family still goes to church on a regular basis. I used to only go on Christmas with them, and as of recently, I've set a firm boundary that I'm not going at all. So it's like there are conflicts, and it is like I do sometimes feel like I am being disobedient in some way, or like
Mm.
I'm being like a drama queen, like it is just
Mm.
an hour of my time, so on and so forth. So I think it's unlearning a lot of things, processing things that have been traumatic, and then also like just conflict with people in my life who still yeah, really value those beliefs.
Right. It's funny because when I hear you talk about even standing firm and I'm not going just on Christmas, and I hear you using terms like, am I being, I don't know what you just said, a spoiled brat. I don't know if that's the right term, but like it's an
A
hour
drama
of my
queen, but
time.
I mean,
A brat, I don't know. I don't know. But like, is it just, it's just an hour of my time, whatever. I'm like listening to you say this, and the first thing that's going through my head is like boundaries, 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 like, because that's how we end up falling into traps of living out of alignment with our values. Is, well, it's
yeah,
just an hour, it's just a dinner, it's just a holiday tradition.
yeah,
And then we feel so dysregulated in that because it's just not in alignment with what we actually want. And oftentimes I think, especially with family, it's like if you give an inch, a mile is expected back. So
yeah,
it's hard to know like how much is enough, and are you doing it for you, or are you doing it to please other people? And if you're doing
mhm,
it to please other people, is that actually going to please them, or be like creeping open a can of worms? And I heard you say earlier, I'm a people pleaser. So I guess
100%.
if you were to talk to someone who was you, maybe, I don't know, let's say 10 years ago, who is starting to question if their values are in alignment with their, you know, family of origin or the people that they grew up with, and they don't know how to proceed with it, what advice would you give?
I think one would be just like finding spaces and people that validate these things and like that you feel connected to, because I think it's hard enough to like have those thoughts and feelings, let alone to talk about them. So I think being in spaces where that's welcomed and not shut down is really, really important.
Yeah.
So yeah, connecting with people or places that you feel like you can say what you're actually thinking instead of what you're supposed to be thinking. And then I think too, I'm looking at notes, honestly. So give me a second here because there's a million things that come to my brain.
Yeah.
Um, I think too, like exploring, this is maybe similar to that, but like exploring things that I don't know, make you feel good about yourself. Like I think that there's so much shame. Like and so much of like I should be doing this that you're not looking for what actually makes you feel good or like raises you up. So
Mm,
not just places where you can have these conversations, but places where you don't feel like less than once you've participated in. So I think that would be really important. And also, as you said, boundaries. Like it's okay to not believe in the same things. At the end of the day, I'm not forcing people that I love to stop believing in those things. I have every right to believe in what I believe in. And so just firm boundaries around it doesn't even need to be like what you believe in, but just what you're willing to do or not to do or to participate in. Or even like to me, that looks like conversation. So I think it's been a long time to put that boundary down of like, because it's like you said, if you give a little bit, a lot has can be taken. So yeah, I think closing the conversation sometimes, like I'm not willing to have this conversation right now or anytime. Like I don't
mm,
want to participate in it. And as a people pleaser, that's really hard. That's really uncomfortable. You feel like an asshole, but it's
yeah.
so important. So I think conversations are also like a really important boundary to have. Um, yeah, and I think too, like different people feel these things very differently.
Mm,
So I just want to speak to like for my privilege and being like a cis woman and um I just feel deeply for the queer community and how certain religions have treated them. So I think that like if I feel this um amount of like shame and it's been this amount of processing to unlearn a lot of these things, yeah, I just feel for people who have had a different experience than me as well.
100%.
Yeah, yeah.
I wonder actually with this, like, because obviously you and I are social workers by training, and there's a very distinct set of ideologies in social work around like general acceptance and social justice and um, equity and equality. I wonder if there has ever been any sort of like dissonance for you between trying to unlearn what you once knew and adopt more of like the ideology that comes with practicing social work.
Yeah, 100%. But I think that like I personally value a lot of kind of more of the social work ideology anyways. So
Mm-hmm.
for me, like that is more of my personal ideology. So there was already this like huge dissonance between those two things. So I didn't feel like going into social work there was. I was kind of already like I fully said to my family at age 16, like I'm no longer, this is not something I'm interested in anymore.
Mm,
So it had been like by the time I was in social work, a lot of that had already happened and was in the works and was being practiced. So
right.
I don't think it was necessarily huge in terms of work, but in terms of like personally and how I was raised. Yeah.
For sure. 16, you expressed that you were drawing a line. Did you live at home until you were like 18? How many years did you live at home after that?
So honestly, it was not ideal. Yeah, at 16, yeah, it was this formal like dinner. I was like, I had really worked myself up to it. I was like slowly being less and less engaged in church and in going, and it was like an expectation. So yeah, at 16 at dinner, I had this, like, I let my parents know that this is, I'm not going to attend anymore, and these are the reasons why. And it was very much like, if you're living under our roof, this is what the expectation is. So I continued to go against what I would have chosen for quite a few years. So then again, I was still living with my parents at 18. So at 18, I tried again. I was like, I'm a legal adult. I do not believe in these things. Like they knew obviously I was going to church just because I had to be there. And I didn't resonate with it. And I tried again and it was maybe like a little bit more successful but not a ton. It was just a lot of like disappointment and like yeah, a lot of things about like it's laziness, it's like a phase, it's whatever. So just not a lot of validation. So I would go off and on basically to appease my parents for
Mhm.
quite a number of years. And then I moved out in my early 20s. And that was when I completely Well, I would go again, like it's like a slippery slope. I
Totally.
would go with them Christmas and Easter because it was really important to them. Yeah, and then at this point in time, I don't go at all. So it's been a very gradual experience. And again, like it's challenging because to this day, love my parents, but it's still like, it's still a conversation and it's still not necessarily respected.
Yeah. If you could be a fly on the wall to other families where they have, let's say, older teens that are trying to assert their own value sets, what what do you wish parents knew versus that youth might know that could be helpful in trying to avoid maybe some of the downfalls that come with just being like, this is the end of the road, like take it or leave it
Mhm.
type mentality?
Yeah, I think just like listening is the biggest thing. Like, I think as a parent, and maybe as more like a traditional parent, it is like very top down, like, I'm the
Hmm.
parent, this is how it is. And so I think just listening, like, I'm explaining reasons why, or this kid is explaining reasons why this is important to them. So actually listen instead of getting defensive, maybe, or like, and I think too, just belief systems. Like, it's okay to have different beliefs. And I think too, like, the more that somebody is forced into a certain thing, the less they'll probably want to participate in it. So if
Yes.
your goal is for your kid to be in the same community of faith as you, probably forcing them to do those things will not be to your benefit or to your relationship benefit with your child.
Mm.
So I
Totally.
think, yeah, listening would be the biggest thing. And then also, yeah, forcing somebody to do something never goes well.
Yeah. I often
Yeah.
think like, and this comes up so often, that the one thing we've lost as like a society as a whole is tolerance, just the ability to sit at a table with people who might have completely different ideologies, value sets, backgrounds, experiences, and just have nothing but mutual respect for everyone's right to choose. And remembering that we ask that people respect our right to choose, but in doing that, we also have to give respect to others' right to choose as well. And I
Mhm.
wish that we weren't so fixated on like trying to convert people to understand our way of looking at things, but instead like be open to listening and learning why something might be so meaningful to another person. And despite the fact that we might agree or disagree with it, just unconditionally accept them as they are. Um, and I think that there's limits to that, in that we want to be peaceful, we want people to not have intention to hurt others or minimize others. And it can be really hard, I think, in particular social circles, families being probably the number one pillar of this, to be super close to people and know that you have very differing value sets. But it comes with understanding that in order to have a healthy relationship, you have to have unconditional acceptance for people's right to
Mhm.
choose. And
Mhm.
it can't be all or nothing. There's very few things in life that are all or nothing that work effectively. And,
Yeah.
I always feel like it's hard in these conversations for someone like myself, because I don't know what it's like to have a different religious ideology than my family, but I absolutely know what it's like to have a different value set than my family when it comes to certain topics. And
Mhm.
I think if anyone knows what that's like to kind of step outside of your family of origin and realize that maybe you're not fully in alignment with things that you were told to be
Mhm.
100% true, you can at least empathize with other people who are going at this from a more like religious standpoint. It's hard to draw a line. It's hard to say no to your parents. It's hard to feel like you are a disappointment, or you're letting people down, or you're a failure in response to trying to just be honest with yourself. So yeah, I think like, above all else, the fact that you're even willing to have this conversation publicly, it to me is about minimizing shame in so many
Mhm.
ways. um I don't know about you, and I can definitely see a connection to this when it comes to like the religious community, but I personally see shame as one of like the biggest diseases of our mental health ever. Like shame in and of itself, I think, is probably the root cause of a lot, if not majority, of our mental health disorders. And any sort of culture that perpetuates shame is so harmful. But if we can learn that shame is something that we internalize, but we also have control to like shut that off or change the dialogue. I mean, maybe I'm biased. I'm like, come to therapy. We'll help you flip shame to something else. But like, I think that that's always been my understanding is when, I don't know, in my perspective from an outsider, when I hear the term religious trauma, I initially connect it to shame and shame culture.
Mhm.
So, is that a fair thing to say, you think, at least from your perspective?
Totally. Yeah, I think so much of it is shame. And like you said, with shame is stigma and then a lack of information. And so it's just like a constant cycle. I think what's really challenging is like you can't do anything with it when you don't know or have the words,
Mm.
right? So it's like when you're a teenager and you're feeling these things, like at that time I was thinking like there's something wrong with me, right? Which is that shame speaking, or like that I'm like dirty in this certain way or whatever. And so you don't think like, oh, this is religious trauma, I should seek therapy, right? Which
Yeah, totally.
obviously I wish that I went to therapy earlier than I did. I think it would have been greatly helpful. But you think you internalize these things, which is like you're saying is shame. And so when you don't have the words or like the understanding of what's going on, and you think like this is a you issue and not a bigger issue than that, then it's really hard to know how to even ask for help, like, or even Google on the internet for help when you don't know what's going on, right? So I
Totally.
think that's why it's so important to, like I said, it's uncomfortable for me. It's a hard conversation to just put on the internet, especially because like I love my family and I do think that they yeah, for them, it's genuinely their beliefs and they are trying to, um, they've found ways to rely on it and that it brings them comfort and they want that for me. So it's challenging, but I think that's why it's so important. Just like if we don't openly talk about topics like this and people don't have the words and they don't know what to even ask for or what's going on with them. So it's just important to put out there for sure.
Yeah, I feel like, in an ideal world, people would access therapy for sure, learn the words, learn to challenge their own thoughts. I'm like, come on, come to us. But I also think it'd be interesting to talk about family therapy and having two different parties that have completely different sets of ideologies or values and have them come together and have a really respectful conversation about how to navigate that. I think in an ideal world, I could see that being incredibly helpful too. And that's kind of the beauty of having a mediator, is that you get challenged on maybe what you're saying or doing that's minimizing the opinion of someone else or blocking you from reaching a solution. And I think opening up those conversations in a way that's invited by both people with the same intended outcome, which is like, I want to move forward with our relationship in a healthy way, despite the fact we're never going to see eye to eye on this. Oh my gosh, can you imagine all the problems we would solve if that's the way we
I was gonna say, it
felt?
sounds lovely. Like I love
Ew.
it, but realistically, yeah,
Right?
I think it's again, yeah, it's challenging. And I think in an ideal world, that would be great. I also think like I'm all for tolerance and like having hard conversations and seeing other people's sides. But I also think that like when it comes to outright homophobia or transphobia, like there's no such thing. So I think that's something that's challenging too. It's like,
Mm.
yes, we can have these conversations in family systems and in trying to like see eye to eye, but when the system itself is like directly discriminatory and continues to be allowed to do that, like there are bigger systems issues there that we can't solve as much as I would like to in a
I
family
would love
therapy
to.
session.
But you know what? You are one brave soul. You truly are, for, stepping out of
Thank you.
your own nature nurture conversation, challenging it, and then beyond that, actually spending the rest of your life advocating for the betterment of these conversations as a whole and being there for people. It's really hard to come out and tell the people that you're closest to that you have a different set of values. It's a whole other ballgame to go on a public platform and do the same thing, not just today, but in general with what you've done with your life. And so I just have nothing but respect and admiration for you and what you're
Thank
doing.
you.
I feel very grateful that you choose to work with my team and me, because I'm like, oh, that is that takes some type of character. And yeah, I hope that you know that about yourself. It's
Thank you. No,
insanely
I
inspiring.
appreciate that.